Far from catching a mere glimpse of another time, those who have reported time slips claim to have experienced full immersion in a time out of place. For those who claim to have temporarily visited the past, or indeed the future, it is suggested that the very fabric of our reality is more fluid than we believe. As such, here are 5 cases of people who allege to have experienced a distortion in time. Air Marshal Sir Victor Goddard was a senior commander in the British Royal Air Force in the 1940s. What would be remembered as a distinguished military career began some years earlier in the 1920s, when he read engineering at the University of Cambridge. From there, Goddard became an instructor to the university's air squadron, and later served as a commander for a bomber squadron. In 1935, he was appointed Deputy Director of Intelligence at the Air Ministry. It was at this point that Goddard experienced something that would both haunt and fascinate him for the rest of his life. In his 1975 book, Flight Towards Reality, Goddard recalls a flight he made in 1935 to Edinburgh, Scotland, from Andover, England. As he approached Edinburgh, his plane passed over a dilapidated airfield in Drem, Scotland. From Goddard's observations, the base had clearly been abandoned for some time. Vegetation had overtaken most of the area, and cattle from a nearby farm had moved in. Thinking nothing more of it, Goddard continued his flight until he reached Edinburgh. A few days later, Goddard was due to return to Andover. Following the same flight path as before, he headed in the direction of Drem. However, before he reached the airfield, he flew into bad weather. Goddard described the storm as strange. Along with strong winds and torrential rain, the storm clouds were yellow. Disoriented and quickly losing control of his plane, the experienced pilot climbed the clouds, hoping to burst through into the clear sky. However, they appeared to have no end. It was at this moment that the storm clouds finally broke beneath him, and Goddard was able to see the ground again. Ahead of him was Drem Airfield. Relieved to see a familiar sight, he left the storm behind him and flew into sun and clear skies. Yet, as Goddard got closer, he realized that the Drem airfield was not so familiar after all. In fact, it was completely different. Far from being reclaimed by the surrounding nature, the Drem airfield was alive with activity. Not only was it no longer abandoned, it looked pristine. Mechanics were bustling on the ground below, and 4 planes, each painted bright yellow, sat on the runway. Most strange, however, was how Goddard was unable to identify one of the planes. It was a monoplane, unlike any that the Royal Air Force used. In addition to the strangeness of the yellow planes, Goddard was also surprised to see the mechanics dressed in blue overalls. To his knowledge, all RAF mechanics wore brown. Having little time to digest what he was seeing, Goddard passed over the airfield at Drem and flew back into the storm. The clear skies and bright sun were replaced by the same torrential rain and yellow clouds as before. Once again, he struggled to keep control of his aircraft. Eventually, he was able to wrestle free of the tempest and make it back safely to Andover. When he told his friends what he had seen during his flight, he was greeted with skepticism. The airfield at Drem had, after all, been vacated in 1919. And from 1933 had only seen occasional use from visiting squadrons. There was no possibility of there being an active squadron with planes and mechanics at the airfield when Goddard made his flight in 1935. 4 years after Goddard's peculiar experience in 1939, the overgrown airstrip at Drem was resurfaced, and the whole airfield transformed and reactivated, becoming home to the No. 13 Flying Training School. Not only that, the RAF began to paint their training planes yellow, and a new monoplane, the Miles M14 Magister, joined the roster. By that year, even the mechanics' overalls had been updated to blue instead of brown. Goddard's vision had become a reality. After that, Sir Victor Goddard developed a fascination with paranormal phenomena. He was certain that he had visited the future during his flight in 1935. Karl Gustav Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. An early supporter of the founding father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, Jung shared Freud's interest in the unconscious and would go on to revolutionize the psychiatric perspective of man's placement within time and within the world at large. One of his most famous theories is the theory of synchronicity. This concept argues for the existence of meaningful coincidences, that events are somehow meaningful if they occur with no causal relationship yet seem to be related. It is said that it was because of Jung's lifelong engagement with the paranormal that he was able to make this observation. In the early 1930s, Jung and a female acquaintance visited the ancient town of Ravenna, Italy, once the capital of the Western Roman Empire before it collapsed in 476. In his posthumously published semi-autobiographical book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung describes having fallen into a strange mood in the tomb of Galla Placidia. Born in the 4th century AD, Placidia was the daughter of a Roman emperor and a major force in Roman politics for most of her life. This was not the psychiatrist's first connection with the Roman princess. 2 decades earlier, in 1913, he had first visited her tomb and had first felt the same feeling. Writing about his second visit, Jung recalls that he and the lady he was with went directly from the tomb where he had had the strange sensation to the baptistery of Neon, a religious building which is the most ancient monument remaining in the city of Ravenna. It was upon entering the building that Jung described being struck by a mild blue light that filled the room. Yet, what amazed him the most about the building were 4 great mosaic frescoes of incredible beauty. According to Jung, the mosaics stood in place of the windows which he recalled having seen on his first visit to Ravenna in 1913. In his autobiography, Jung describes the mosaics in great detail. The impressive religious artwork left such an impression that even many years later he could see every detail before his eyes. So captivated by their beauty, he decided he would like to purchase photographs of the 4 mosaics. After a quick search, he could not find any for sale. As he was pressed for time, he decided he would postpone the purchase until later and order the pictures from Zurich. When back home, Jung asked an acquaintance who was due to visit Ravenna to obtain some photos for him. However, when he returned, his acquaintance explained that he had been unable to do so, for not only were the pictures non-existent, but the very mosaics Jung had described seeing did not exist either. Jung was shocked. He remembered seeing the mosaics, with the memory of the artwork still vivid in his mind at the time of writing. He described his experience in Ravenna as being among the most curious events in his life. In his book, Jung went on to explain the possible cause of his vision. As he had felt a strong connection to Galla Placidia's tomb since his first visit, he suggested that his unconscious mind integrated with Placidia's, and that in doing so, his conscious mind became completely immersed in her history. He proposed that, in that moment of immersion, the actual walls were covered over by a vision of some altogether different sight. Curiously, the lady whom Jung was with during the visit to Ravenna also remembered seeing the mosaics. Thus, far from being simply a projection of personal unconsciousness, as Jung suggested, the experience was a shared one. Jung described how his female companion long refused to believe that what she had seen with her own eyes had not existed. What was the blue light that the pair experienced upon entering the baptistery? Did Jung's professed connection to Galla Placidia allow him and his companion to step back in time, so as to be momentarily immersed in the Roman princess's world? Nestled in the Andes Mountains near Lima, Peru, there lies a plateau inundated with mystery known as Markawasi. The area is unique for the fact that the shape of its huge granite rocks are thought to resemble human faces, animals, and religious symbols. Many have supposed that these shapes were created by pre-Columbian civilizations, but in fact, archaeologists have stated that the curious shapes of the rocks are naturally occurring. Because of these strange formations, the plateau is sometimes referred to as the Stone Forest, with a rich body of testimonies and stories having developed around the area. There have been many UFO sightings reported around the Stone Forest, with some people even believing that a race of mysterious beings live in tunnels under the area. Several visitors have reported altered states of inner consciousness that have supposedly led to the development of clairvoyant abilities. Over the years, stories like these and others have attracted many people seeking to investigate and explore the location. Author, editor, and translator of paranormal works from Latin America and Spain, Scott Corrales, has detailed an account allegedly sent to him by Dr. Raul Rios Centeno, a medical physician who described to Corrales how he had treated a patient who had entered Markawasi and was left half paralyzed. After personally having performed several medical examinations, Dr. Centeno found her condition to be incredibly unusual, for there were no discernible traumatic injuries or bleeding vessels to evidence the cause of her paralysis. According to Corrales' article, Dr. Centeno described how his patient, whom he keeps anonymous, stated that they had entered the ancient stone forest with some friends late at night and were lured by strange music to a small torch-lit cabin. Through the window of the cabin, they allegedly saw people dancing inside. According to the patient, I felt a sudden sensation of cold, which I paid little attention to, and I stuck my head through an open door. It was then that I saw the occupants were clad in 17th century fashion. Supposedly, as she started to go inside to join the party, one of her friends pulled her away rapidly. The half of her body that had crossed the threshold was the half that was claimed to be paralyzed. Dr. Centeno continued to describe how, after conducting many tests, he and his colleagues were forced to dismiss the case as an unknown affliction. The patient was prescribed regular physical therapy at Lima's National Hospital in the hope that it would help her paralysis, without further attempting to explain the cause. Personally, however, Dr. Centeno is said to believe that the partial entry of this person into the anomalous zone was able to produce a change in the energy flow existing in her nervous system. The details of the case, according to Corrales, seem to suggest that Dr. Centeno's patient experienced a time slip, and that the distortion of time caused a physical injury. With a history of anomalous phenomena, could the stone forest of Markawasi contain a portal to the past? On an August afternoon in 1901, two English women, Charlotte Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, were touring the Palace of Versailles in Paris. The women were both highly educated academics. Jourdain was the author of several textbooks and tutored English children in Paris, and Moberly had been appointed the first principal of a hall of residence for young women at St. Hugh's College in Oxford in 1886. As they walked about the Palace of Versailles, the pair struggled to enjoy themselves due to their ignorance of the history of the location. However, they persevered and decided to go and visit the Petit Trianon, a small chateau located on the grounds of the palace, which had once been the home of Marie Antoinette. On their way there, however, Moberly and Jourdain claimed to have become lost. As they tried to find their way, the women said they encountered two men, who they described as very dignified officials, dressed in long greyish-green coats and small three-cornered hats. The men supposedly directed them to go straight on. Soon after, they came upon a circular kiosk surrounded by woods on all sides. They would later ascribe this place as the Temple d'Amour, a garden folly located in the gardens of Petit Trianon. Beside the kiosk, there was what they described as a rough-looking man in a coat, who supposedly put the pair of them on edge. Suddenly, a different man ran up to the pair and told the women, in strange and heavily accented French, to go towards the house which was to their right. As this was the direction away from the dark character by the kiosk, the two of them obliged him and started to go in the indicated direction. When they looked back to thank him, however, the man had allegedly disappeared. Morbely and Jourdain proceeded in the indicated direction, which supposedly took them over a small rustic bridge to an English garden in front of a square building with lots of windows. It was then that they supposedly noticed a lady sitting nearby, holding out a paper as though to look at it at an arm's length. According to their later written testimonies, they assumed the woman to be sketching. Supposedly, she had on a shady white hat perched on a good deal of fair hair that fluffed around her forehead. Her light summer dress was arranged on her shoulders in handkerchief fashion. Her dress was old-fashioned and rather unusual. In their own words, the women described their experience as being unnatural, therefore unpleasant, for even the trees behind the building seemed to have become flat and lifeless, like a wood worked in tapestry. Their surroundings were claimed to have been intensely still, with an ominous quality to them. After observing the woman sketching, a footman supposedly approached the two women and directed them to a party of other visitors whom they subsequently toured the house with. Moberly and Jourdain did not mention the events that occurred in the gardens that day to one another until a week afterwards, at which point they discussed their belief that the Petit Trianon was haunted. 1 month later, at Oxford, they wrote separate accounts of what had happened and compared them afterwards. Both of their accounts were very similar. Furthermore, after revisiting the chateau, the pair found that the gardens were very different from what they had seen during their first visit. The small bridge that they had crossed over, for example, was not there. It was, however, present on an old map of the gardens. Further exploring the possibility that they had stumbled upon some sort of special event occurring that day at the palace, the pair researched the matter but found that nothing of any particular note had occurred the day of their visit. After researching their experience to the best of their abilities, the two women came to believe that what they had experienced that day was a glimpse into the past. To be precise, a glimpse into the life of the ill-fated Queen of France, Marie Antoinette. In 1913, Moberly and Jourdain published their accounts and research in a book called An Adventure, which caused a sensation at the time. Skeptics were ready to dismiss their experience as a shared delusion or as a misinterpretation of normal events. One theory in particular suggested that they had inadvertently stumbled into one of the reputed and eccentric-themed parties of the French poet Robert de Montesquieu, who was known to have dressed in period dress along with his guests so as to relive the time period. Whatever the case may be, Moberly and Jourdain's experience continues to intrigue and perplex, with dramatizations of their case being broadcast as recently as 2015. With such a high level of detail and research in their testimonies, as well as their reputations as witnesses, many have been left wondering if the women really did experience a time slip that day in Versailles. There is a road in the United Kingdom that is claimed to produce more than its fair share of time anomalies. Bold Street in Liverpool has been associated with time slips for decades, with many people having testified that this bustling shop-lined high street contains a passageway to the past. One of the earliest known accounts is said to date back to 1996, when Frank, a police officer from Merseyside, went shopping with his wife Karl. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon and the pair agreed to split up. Frank wanted to look for a new CD at a music shop and Karl wanted to go to Dylan's bookshop on Bold Street. Frank agreed to meet his wife at the bookshop and so, after finishing at the music shop, walked into Bold Street. Upon passing the Lyceum, a 19th century neoclassical building which marks the entrance of the road, Frank claimed to have experienced a peculiar sensation. Everything had gone quiet. Before he had a chance to ponder this change any further, a small box van supposedly honked its horn and skidded around Frank, narrowly missing him. The police officer claimed that the van looked as though it belonged in the 1950s and had the name Kaplan's stenciled on its side. Confused, Frank stepped out of the road and headed in the direction of Dylan's bookshop. As he got closer, however, he saw that the name Cripps hung above the shop, and that rather than displaying books, the windows were lined with women's handbags and shoes. According to the police officer's story, it was then that he looked around and realized that people in the street were dressed rather strangely, seemingly wearing clothing from the 1940s and 50s. One person, a young woman in her 20s, stood out from the rest. She was dressed in a lime-coloured sleeveless top and carried a handbag that Frank recognized as a popular modern-day brand. They smiled at each other as she passed him and headed into Crips. As he followed her inside, it is claimed that the interior of the shop suddenly changed. Gone were the handbags and shoes, and in their place were bookshelves laden with paperbacks. Frank turned to the young woman, who seemed to be equally confused. When he asked her if she had seen what he had, she supposedly said yes, and explained that she had thought it was a new clothes shop and had been surprised to find the building full of books. Befuddled, Frank found his wife and went home, unable to shake his experience. Later, he found out that a local business called Kaplan's did once exist, and that the bookshop he agreed to meet his wife in used to be a ladies' shawl shop called Crips. Frank's story is far from singular. There have been many other strange reports from Bold Street, including one from a shoplifter called Sean, who, whilst running away from a security guard in 2006, claimed to have been transported back to 1967. When interviewed by a journalist after his alleged experience, Sean stated that he felt a sensation of tightness in his chest, before realizing that his surroundings had changed. Roadworks that he knew were there were gone, and people were dressed oddly. At a newspaper kiosk, Sean claimed to have seen an edition of the Daily Post dating to Thursday the 18th of May, 1967. Whilst it is easy to dismiss individual claims as either fanciful or fiction, the abundance of reports which connect Liverpool's Bold Street with slips in time are difficult to ignore. Several people have offered theories as to why Bold Street has produced so many similar accounts. A local journalist has stated that there is a crack in time in the vicinity. Others have pointed to the city's underground railway system, claiming that the high-voltage rails form a circle close to Bold Street, and that this might have something to do with the creation of a portal through time. Rather eerily, people who worked and resided in Bold Street in the 1960s, the decade which many claim to have slipped back to, seem to have agreed that something was not quite right on their road. When Chris Gibson, the founder of the community and construction project Future Liverpool, went down into the cellar of one of Bold Street's shops with a colleague in 2010, they were disturbed to find several unsettling messages written on the walls. One, which dated to February 1966, read, "God have mercy on all who enter here." Another, dated 3 years later, confirmed the first's warning, stating, "It's no joke." Gibson also reported hearing bizarre noises coming from within the room, including a low buzzing sound mixed with a sort of clattering. What were these messages referring to? And are they connected to Bold Street's infamous reputation as a hotspot for slips in time? Did a traumatic event take place in Bold Street in the 1960s that has left a scar across time? Thank you for watching. What do you think about the 5 cases featured in this video? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have not already, don't forget to subscribe and follow me on social media for more of the paranormal. If you cannot wait until my next video, why not check out another suggested on screen now? Until next time.